Well, hi, everybody, and welcome to Circle of Fellows for July 2021. I'm Shel Holtz. I am an IABC Fellow. I'm internal communications at WebCore, a commercial builder headquartered in the San Francisco Bay Area. And it is my pleasure to be here with three additional IABC Fellows for a conversation today about crisis communication and leadership. And we're going to jump into that conversation in just a minute. First, I want to make sure that those of you who are watching live know that you can ask questions, share comments and observations. Just use the chat feature on YouTube. And with that, let's meet the panel. The three of the four panelists who are joining us today, and I'm expecting the fourth to pop in at any moment. We're going to go clockwise, and Carolyn, that makes you first. And a special welcome to you. You are part of the 2021 class of fellows, and this is your first circle.
Thank you very much, Shel. Nice to see you all, Jim and Martha. It's a pleasure to be on this podcast with you and to share insight and all sorts of great ideas from so many veteran communicators. So I'm Caroline. I'm originally French, bilingual, with a Canadian father. And I have been in communication. I started my career in communication since the early 80s in a very far away country called Taiwan, because I had studied sinology and I ended up in Taiwan. And then joined IABC in 1987 because Taiwan was a bit of a backwater in those days in terms of communication, and I needed all the help I could get. And then through experiences in the late 80s, I then specialized in crisis management because I've handled a few crises. And in 1991, I set up CSNA International, my own firm, together with my business partner, Dirk Leenaerts. We set up in Hong Kong. We're still headquartered in Hong Kong, and we operate globally. And the focus of our work is in risk, crisis, and business continuity management for across industries, mostly multinationals around the world.
Great, and it's wonderful to have you here, Carolyn. Jim, you're up next, and I understand that you are just across the bay from me today.
There you go, right. I'm in Silicon Valley, and it's chilly this morning. I came to public relations from service. I had gone back to college, this is years ago, and got an internship by chance in the governor's press office at that time. That sort of started things off for me. And I had that internship for 13 months. I graduated, and they offered me a job, which was fantastic. And so I spent another 5 years in state government, Minnesota, serving in various capacities. And then I left in 1978 to start my own firm here in Minneapolis, and ultimately wound up in New York for 30 years with a firm there, which was a president, and then our own firm with my wife and I. Ultimately wound up in Minnesota. She retired and wanted to be home with her mom, which was great because we loved her too. And but the rest is sort of history with my government service. I specialized almost immediately outside of government in something really new at that time, which is called executive coaching, media training, actually, was a predecessor. And crisis management was not a thing yet when I started in 1978, but it soon became a thing. And then I not drifted, I sort of plunged into, like Carolyn was talking about, I got in government, it's a crisis a day. So that was good experience for my own moving forward. And so my firm became very unique in its expertise. And so I had time to write some books and some articles and did it around the country. And did a very interesting career. I've been at it for 42 years.
Wow.
Excellent. And nice to have you on my time zone, Jim. Martha, you're up next.
I'm Martha Muzychka, and I'm based in St. John's, Newfoundland, the far east of Canada. And I've been working in communications now close to 30 years. It's kind of shocking, actually, how the time has flown. I started off in nonprofit, working in policy and research, and then I moved to public health, where crisis has a different connotation and plays out somewhat differently. But it was a great 10 years there, and then I went out on my own. And I've actually used that experience of public health working in nonprofits to look at reputation management and to anticipate, because a lot of my clients have seen crises emerge, but they didn't think it would happen to them because they weren't a big company, they weren't a hospital, they weren't a corporate institution. So it's been very interesting work to get them on that path to anticipation, planning, practice, and execution to managing crisis. And I'd say the biggest challenge, and I think one of the aspects of the topic today, is how we work with leaders to manage that crisis effectively, not just in the short term, but also in the aftermath, the recovery period, in terms of how they respond to their publics, the people that work with them, and the communities in which they live and work.
Great. And John Deveney, our fourth panelist, is apparently logging in, but I haven't seen him yet. So when he's able to join us, we'll let him introduce himself. But let's get started. And I'd like to start with a really easy softball question for you all. What is a crisis? And the reason I ask is I've heard so many definitions, and I don't like most of them because most of them seem to me that they're actually talking about emergencies, which are different. I have always thought a crisis is something that you didn't see coming and that you didn't prepare for, but I'd love to hear your definitions. Let's go backwards. Martha, how about we start with you?
Well, I think for me, a crisis is when something happens that you could have anticipated, but you didn't, but it wasn't what you expected, and something throws a wrench in the monkey works, and you're off to the races having to deal with multiple monkeys all clamoring for your attention.
Right, and a threat to the organization at some level, right?
Exactly.
Jim, anything different? Anything to add?
Actually, I sort of on a very short crisis definition. Last year, there were 20 new crisis books that I got to look at last year, and everyone, Shel, had a different definition, and and nothing really touched on what I think is the most important point. So this is my definition of crisis. I find a crisis as a show-stopping, people-stopping, product-stopping, reputationally defining, trust-busting situation that creates victims and or explosive visibility. My emphasis on victims because we don't talk about that, but they determine where it goes. And what you do for them determines what they're going to do or not do to you going forward. Just this brief definition, I think it captures what we have to have, and we can work based on that.
Great. And Carolyn, what's your definition?
Well, it's interesting because I've used the same definition for 30 years. And at one point I thought that it would run out of, it would become outdated. But in fact, it was probably a bit ahead of its time because I, from the beginning, made a difference between the event-related crises and smoldering crises, which are much harder to detect. And so the definition I used was that it could be an event, can be a revelation, could be an allegation, could be a set of circumstances that threatens the organization, its survival, its sense of integrity, safety, and that you can't stop on your own. It's out there in the court of public opinion. The public is saying, I don't like you. Not sure I'm going to continue to trust you. And all stakeholders is saying, let's watch and see how this evolves and how you handle it. So I've used the same definition over and over again because I always felt that indeed, like you say, Shel, the tendency was to focus on events and emergencies that were so severe that they led to crises. But actually, in many cases, there are no events. There is no plane dropping from the sky. There is no fire. There is no shootout. There is could be just a revelation. And ultimately, everything unravels from there. Or not, if it's well handled.
Right, we're going to spend a lot of time talking about leadership in a crisis today, but there's one elephant in the room I'd like to address before we go any further, and that is our colleagues in the legal profession. There are a lot of CEOs who defer to lawyers who have been hired at pretty substantial salaries in order to minimize risk. and the lawyers who feel that anything that you say during a crisis can be raised again during lawsuits and legal actions will counsel their clients to say nothing, which is why we hear no comment in so many crises. How do we work with, because I assume you all agree that no comment really isn't an option. How do we work with our friends in the legal department in order to get the leaders of the organization to take the right steps to minimize the risk and address the issues that the crisis has raised? And I'll throw that out to whoever would like to answer.
The answer, two answers. One is, when you fail to speak, risk explodes. And it explodes in your face. Even if you're tangentially involved in whatever's going on, my advice to clients, first and foremost, is hire more lawyers. You're going to need them, and you're going to use them. But when we're talking about your reputation, and for the CEO, generally his or her job, there's the only job at risk in a situation like this is the boss's job. They don't fire PR people, they don't fire HR, they don't even fire lawyers, but they fire. It's cheaper and easier to fire and pay off the boss and hire somebody new. So the threat is real across the line, and also the use of attorneys is very important, and they are very valuable. The issue in crisis for leadership is their leadership. And so we're going to be talking from the beginning, not about lawyers, not about the media, not about all this other stuff, but what this means to them and what the public and the victims are expecting of them going forward. That's where I start. And it's an interesting discussion always because the lawyers are so dogmatic about what they're doing. I always like to offer my clients options for action, and doing is an option. Toxic one, but it can be chosen, but there are risks to doing that.
I was going to say that I think we need to make a difference between the litigating environment of the United States versus the rest of the world. And I think it's particularly acute in the US. In my experience, actually, in many cases, lawyers have been extremely close collaborators. And I've worked with quite a few over the years. And the recognition was that each one, so the lawyer, the communicators, the risk people, are there to advise the crisis leader, and the leader needs to take that advice and ultimately call the shots and make the decisions. So it is wise to listen to lawyers, but not necessarily let lawyers or communicator or anybody dictate the way it should be done. I think it's a collaborative, consultative approach, whilst taking into account, obviously, the legal ramification of any risky situation.
Martha, any thoughts?
I think also working with lawyers, you get a different feel when the crisis is something that is affecting your company but wasn't necessarily caused by your company. And so there's a certain comfort level that your reputation will be governed by how you respond to a particular instance. So a number of years ago, a bank in Canada experienced a significant breakdown in their computer systems, and so deposits weren't recorded. A company I work with recently had come out of a 4-week strike, and this was the first pay period that employees were getting paychecks again. So we had a responsibility to figure out an option in terms of making sure people got their pay. So it was easier to persuade the leadership and work with the lawyers about how this would happen, because we weren't necessarily at fault that the people didn't get their paychecks, but we knew we were responsible for trying to find a solution that would help our employees. When you are responsible for the crisis, then people start looking at risk and mitigation. And I try to bring people and say, what is our goal as a company? What are our values? How we respond? Are we going to live to the vision and values of our company and provide a solution or respond appropriately in terms of accountability? And, if we are at fault, I always say we should admit it. We should say something went wrong, or this went wrong, or we're working on finding out what went wrong. And then work with the lawyers about how that's managed.
If I can make a comment, when I ask one question generally when this strategy is raised. And first and foremost, when people like coach and train, I would like them to raise it rather than letting the lawyers or the bosses get the first turn at this. But my question is simply this: how are you going to explain it? Because what destroys the reputation of the organization is almost always a period of silence when everyone knows they knew something and said nothing. There is no logical, rational, believable way to explain why you waited an hour or 2 hours or 2 days to talk about something. You can never take it back, and this is the most common criticism of crisis. Why didn't you speak? What did you know? When did you know it? Those sorts of things. And you can't live that down, and people forget. You might have had a terrific, perfect response. I'm loving clients who do respond perfectly, but if you screw up or you fumble and stumble on the stalking part, that's what you live with as a result.
And I also want to say that I think there's a distinction that not every organization makes, is that the difference between responsibility and liability. So if a crisis happens on your turf, whether you cause it or not, you are responsible for dealing with it. And that's a big difference with having caused, so-called, the crisis. So making a difference in the level of attribution of responsibility is a starting point. But like Jim says, no matter what happens, you have to own it. And owning doesn't mean you've caused it.
One of the problems is that actually the issue of crisis is, as you mentioned earlier, it's an explosive, surprising circumstance. And but you treat it as a sort of day-to-day problem for a while. The controlling factor is going to be how the victims are affected. And those victims will determine who's responsible, at least for a period of time. So the issue you all touched on is needed to be able to talk about what needs to be done, when it will be done, what we know, what we think we're going to know. So we're talking from the beginning. We live in, 288 character world these days. We don't count them anymore. We're counting characters. And the more characters slide by without your using them, the more difficult it is to go back to that and start over again, because everybody else has moved on.
I recall reading about a study out of Oxford, researchers analyzing data, and they looked at a cohort of companies that had experienced crises and divided them into two groups. There was one group that listened to the lawyers and said no comment, and the other group had accepted responsibility. They talked about the victims. They basically did what they should have done. And they looked at the share price of these public companies the day before the crisis, the day after the crisis, and then they looked at the share price at the beginning of the next fiscal year. And essentially what happened was the organizations that said no comment ended up with share prices. Obviously, they had dropped substantially the day of the crisis, but they had not recovered by the start of the fiscal year. The companies that had spoken clearly and candidly and authentically not only recovered their share price, but most of them had progressed and the share price had moved up beyond that. So the data suggests that just being honest and following the guidelines of crisis communication serves the organization well from that bottom line perspective. John, good to see you.
Good to be with you. Sorry for my tardiness.
No problem. Everybody else has had a chance to introduce themselves. I'll give you the same opportunity.
John Deveney with Deveney. We're a consulting agency in New Orleans and West Palm Beach, Florida.
Excellent. So the next question, let's start talking about crisis leadership. Is that always the CEO in an organization? Who should be leading a crisis? John, because you haven't had an opportunity to speak yet, I'm going to let you take this one first.
Great. And I also want to comment on just the tail end of what you were saying about the two companies. I think part of what we're seeing is the truth that we always knew is that there are two courts. There's the court of public opinion and there's the court of law. What we're seeing more and more now is that the court of public opinion is ascending and not deferring to the court of law, and that sometimes the court of law is actually now turning and deferring to the court of public opinion. For better or worse, that's what we're seeing through the power of activism. And then as far as should the CEO always be the spokesperson? No. One way to look at it is like a game of chess. And you don't want your CEO to become the face of the crisis. She needs to be certainly the leader. She needs to be present. She needs to be there. But we don't want her necessarily linked to the crisis or the problem that happened. So frequently, the role of that top official is to express or represent the humanity, the concern, the compassion of the organization, and then turn it over to a subject matter expert or others that can speak and should speak more knowledgeably about the situation at hand.
The ultimate model is really to have what I call a crisis leader, which is the team captain. He positions the players on the field, decides on the strategy, and really shifts as the situation evolves. And then behind that is a crisis chair. And that crisis chair is often the CEO, because he's one step removed from the day-to-day of decision making, but he has the ability to be rolled out, so to speak, so that he can express the empathy, the concern, really address stakeholders, and try to do everything he can to retain the trust of those stakeholders. So I think there's two different roles, and often those roles are confused. A crisis leader does not by default need to be the CEO. Absolutely not. I don't think so.
Great. Well, are there different criteria for crisis leaders and general organization leaders? What are we looking for in a crisis leader?
We need decision-making, situational awareness, empathy. We need a raft of competencies that are very poorly defined. In fact, the academia doesn't do very much in that sphere. We've developed a crisis leadership competency protocol that we use when we train leaders. And the perception of leaders is, I've been in my field for 25, 30 years, therefore I'm by default a crisis leader, except the conditions of crises are completely different from the conditions of day-to-day management, where consensus building and majority decision-making is the model that people aspire to, so that you get maximum buy-in. In a crisis, you often, unfortunately, have to revert to a more command and control, where there's shorter time, there's more at stake, and sometimes decisions have to be made without sufficient information. So therefore, the competencies articulated for crisis leadership are definitely different from leadership in normal times. And I think there's not enough recognition of that difference. At the end of the day, crisis is not a bad week at the office.
I think it's interesting that I look at this through this different prism, the victim's experience. And in my view, there's three kinds of victims. You have people, you have animals, living systems. All of these are source for crisis. Everything else is just a band-aid for somebody's budget. But if you hurt people, kill and maim living things, and harm the environment in some way, this is going to be a crisis and treated as such. And I think the makes an interesting point. The issue really is what is it that the victims expect in this situation? We've done research on a number of clients who actually really work to understand what happened to them going forward. And there is a definite pattern of desires for those who are victims, and they're really looking for four kinds of help. Really, they want to talk if they can, or be spoken for. They want to be listened to. They want to be believed. They want to be understood, and they want an apology from somebody. Universally, want an apology. So the toughest issues to deal with from a leadership perspective, because our leadership questions are the empathy aspect of the event, and this concept of who takes the blame, so to speak, going forward. These are really important considerations going forward. Again, you have a perfect response, but you fumble those two, the event itself is almost always viewed as a going forward.
Yeah, I would add that the audiences, and especially the victims, are risk averse. And in addition to all the things that you mentioned they want, Jim, I think they also want to know what you're going to do to make sure this doesn't happen again.
Yeah, I call this talk the walk and walk the talk.
Well, you mentioned risk in the area of study of leadership in crisis. It is called risk addiction. And it comes from those senior managers who've been in the saddle for a long time, and they have questions, but they've stopped hearing any answer but yes. And so they make decisions by literally calculating whether I can live with this or not. It's such an irrational position for leadership to be in, and we're talking all the time about sort of rational approaches. Everybody is in a new status in crisis, and it's very difficult. Even when we're talking about risk communication, they kind of say, risk what? They want to get busy and make decisions and move forward or not. And that becomes this focus of leadership. We've done studies of employees. The first thing they want often is just the truth. Tell us the truth, tell us what happened, and we'll move from there. It's very interesting to look at these things from those perspectives.
Mm-hmm.
Right. Well, Carolyn, you mentioned empathy earlier. How important is empathy? And it can I've heard people say with a straight face, I can fake empathy. Is it something that can be learned? Do you need to find a leader for the crisis who already genuinely has it?
Yeah, I think empathy is something you can learn and practice. Obviously, if you have it naturally, it helps. But I think it can be done. We incorporate this in our training and exercise by making people role play. The stakeholder engagement effort during a crisis is one thing that helps develop empathy. So if you put yourself in the shoes of your opposition or other stakeholders, you clearly will grow as a leader and will develop that empathy. I remember when I was at university, actually, I studied in Israel, and I studied international relations, and it was very interesting how one particular professor actually used to put in the class, we had 17,000 Palestinian students on campus in Jerusalem. So he put all sorts of groups of different nationalities in the same class, and he would reverse the roles. So the Palestinians would become the Israelis would become the Palestinians, the Soviet students, because at the time they were still a Soviet Union, was becoming the United States, and so on and so forth. And then he'd throw a scenario at us. And it was phenomenal how, it's a sort of basic attempt at scenario planning and exercise. It was amazing how after a couple of those sessions, everybody could make decision by taking into account the other side perspective. And I think it's invaluable in a crisis. So the empathy is not, I care. The empathy is really, I can actually empathize with you and make a better decision for you and for us. I think that's the ultimate goal.
Reminds me of high school debate where we had to take both the affirmative and the negative, right? Jim?
Yeah.
Jim, you were going to say?
That's one of the challenges, one of the biggest challenges for us in being on the team and helping the team for crisis. We're the ones, I think, that are looked to look in these really difficult and sort of mushy areas, because in the background of most leaders these days has nothing to do with empathy. It has to do with making the pile higher, so to speak. And they don't naturally deal in empathy. They need some help getting this done. And I mean, look around the team. All the other specialists on the team, very interesting areas, well-defined areas, including the law. This is one that is really difficult. Need instruction, and they know they're going to be criticized. They're going to be called cities and all kinds of other bad things by their cohort, by their colleagues, by their college professors, because this is something they simply don't live with and grow up with. And we're ones who I think are really best equipped to understand and sense these things and help them understand how important this is to their success and perhaps survival.
I think for me, the value of empathy in leadership and taking that on as an active practice is really helpful, because sometimes if you're not in tune with that emotional intelligence, if you will, you miss the signals that you're getting. So often in a crisis, people will present as being extremely angry. They can be rude. They can be quite belligerent and so on. But what's behind that angry face is perhaps a significant amount of fear, or there's loss. And so if you can't recognize what's motivating the anger, to provide an answer. So if you've had an impact, as Jim said, on the environment, we can't drink the water, or we can't play in the playgrounds because it's been poisoned. The fear is for their children and their health. If, as we've discovered in Canada, that thousands of Indigenous children have been buried in unmarked graves, a huge, significant loss to the community as part of a genocidal approach to colonization. That anger masks and you respond to the loss that's there. And I think that's what makes a leader effective in a crisis, is to recognize those emotional undercurrents while still having the wherewithal and the decision making to understand, if I do X, this will have X effect. If I do Y, it will have Y effect. And this is how it will be different for different groups of people, which is why in a crisis we should always look to employees as well, because even though they might not be directly involved, they are also affected by that crisis.
We talked at the beginning of the session about the definition of a crisis and how it's different from, say, an emergency. Generally, when a plane falls from the sky, I don't see that as a crisis because they drilled that. They have the manual. Everybody knows what they're supposed to do. I mean, it's a tragedy and it's a horrible thing, but unless you find the airline did something egregiously wrong, it's an emergency. It's all kinds of things, but you know what to do. You know who to call. You know how to respond. You pull down the playbook and you start executing. For the crisis that you don't see coming, how do you plan? You don't have a binder that you pull down. What is the role of the leader? Melissa Agnes has a whole consulting operation and a book about being crisis ready. It's more about the preparation for the crisis that you don't see coming than it is for the ones that you can create the guidebook for. What is the role of the leader in preparing for a crisis?
Well, I personally would like to say that my first crisis was a major plane crash. And yes, they know the system, they know the drill, they know how to respond. But when you got 259 people dead, it is definitely a crisis, whether the attribution of responsibility is high or low, and you can really mess it up. And the empathy is critical, but very difficult to achieve, because I've been in that situation and you get all sorts of reactions. You get anger, you get pain, you get frustrations, you get people crying. And assuming that if you have the empathy, you can make it any better for them is a fallacy. So I think also accepting that doing the right thing doesn't necessarily mean in a crisis that you're going to win. It means that you are being patient and you understand that their point of view is terrible and critical. So I don't quite agree that it's not a crisis, but having said that, preparedness is everything. And a plane crash, you don't necessarily see coming. It can happen, but you do everything for it not to happen. And there are many other crises that are smoldering where there's a cover-up, where the level of attribution of responsibility is very high, where at the end of the day, no amount of communication is going to save the day, but only actions will. So if you take the Volkswagen crisis, that is a classic case of a smoldering crisis. Something was done wrong, it was covered up, and there was no event. There was no car crash. There was no problem. It's just a revelation of cheating, which is down up to basically human values and loss of trust, complete loss of trust. So the leadership there was, not ideal to start with, to say the least, because at this point, what do you do to recover from something like this without a number of heads falling?
I think it's one of those best books I've ever read on crisis is called Black Box Thinking: Why Some People Learn from Their Mistakes and Others Do Not. It was written by a Canadian person. It contrasted actually the airline industry and its attention to detail and the others. They actually welcome problems. Their issue is preemption. The moment something doesn't work, they put a bulletin, put it ground planes. People step in and investigate. He contrasts that to medicine, mostly in America. But he said in America, nothing gets investigated in medicine because doctors are in charge. And he says if medical errors were considered a disease, it would be the third largest cause of death around the world after cancer and infection. So there's a great variety of attitudes about these things going forward. This particular book is full of wonderful examples, scary examples of the kind of things you're talking about, Shel and Caroline, and it's very practical approaches and systematic thinking about this business of is it a crisis or isn't it a crisis? And the book's about leadership. It is really about making the right decisions and suffering from the wrong decisions. And in my perspective, from my practice, it is recognizing that more unethical decisions are made in crisis decision making than in any other event we deal with in our profession. Smart people intentionally make wrong decisions because they can. And that comes out at some point in the future. Something to think about.
John, I thought you were about to say something.
I was, and I know your question was about preparedness, and it's absolutely the key. And in addition to what Jim and Caroline have said, preparedness is also great because then the crisis leader has an idea of the ability and the strength of the bench that they have internally to work on a crisis. But like Caroline, I want to take exception to your comment that a plane crash isn't a crisis, because absolutely everyone is. We're on the crisis team for a major airline. And first, you don't know right away what the cause of it might have been, and there's an investigation that needs to happen. But also, every crash is different. Who was on board, the tragedy that comes out of that. So even though airlines do a very strong job of preparing and being prepared and having teams prepared to respond to a tragedy like that, every single one is a crisis.
Yeah.
Great.
I would go ahead.
Let me just. There we go. I'm playing camera control at the same time I'm talking. And by the way, I do want to remind those who are watching live that you do have the opportunity to share a question, a comment, an observation through the YouTube chat function. I'm thinking of a crisis in terms of, say, Emory University when they became the place that took the Ebola. These were the American care workers who went over to Eastern Africa to help out, contracted the disease and came back, or they came back and were put into quarantine because they had been exposed to it. And figuring this is just a normal thing that we do, there's no big deal about this. We understand the disease. The conditions in the U.S. are not the same as they are in Eastern Africa, and yet they became the target of a lot of misinformation, and they were attacked pretty solidly. And yet, because they were what Melissa would call crisis ready, were able to address this on social media in a big way. And they're highly lauded for the approach they took to this. So yeah, I certainly understand what you're all saying about a plane crash. Let me distinguish then. There are the ones that you can see coming, planes crash, and the ones that you can't see coming. I would argue that any company that is covering something up should be anticipating a crisis at some point. I know they don't.
And I think this is where the risk management and issues management work comes in. If you know that about 75% of business crises today are not sudden crises but are smoldering, clearly there's a lot of work in at least anticipating or detecting and then mitigating before it blows up in your face. So being crisis ready is about doing the work up front, and it's not only in the hands of communicators. So a lot more in the organization needs to be looked at to be able to identify where the risks are, where the issues are, how they can be mitigated, and then the ones that are not going to be able to be mitigated, how do we then prepare to handle it the best possible way if it does occur? So I think that's the work that needs to be done. And there's not enough connection in my mind between crisis communication and risk management. A lot of communicators, I kid you not, have never seen a risk register of their organization, and it's pretty poor.
And I think that's
accidentally into working is the cruising industry. It's folks have responding, and the things that we're talking about down to pat. They anticipate, they're prepared. In fact, when some cruise ships have these disease outbreaks, they have fires, they have all these sorts of things, and it's increasingly difficult for the media actually to get a handle on something adverse, because the moment that something like this occurs, the company is busy talking to people. They have phone banks. They call families. They keep people informed. They actually, there's a high percentage of people who actually read a cruise during a crisis. And it's interesting, in some cases, there was a fire in the Caribbean some years ago, and the media found only 5,000 passengers and only one couple that talked to them, because all the other couples already had tickets home. They had booked on another cruise. They're going to take more family along. This industry really understands this notion of no pause between accident, circumstance, and response to it very directly. Very interesting model, the way people work.
Yeah, I've worked with a cruise line on one of their crises, and it was a fascinating experience. Martha, you were going to say something?
Well, I recall an exercise I did back in the day when I was preparing for my accreditation. And, I had done workshops and webinars and studied, in depth, particularly when I became a director in the public health agency that I was working with. And one of the exercises was to, what would cause your CEO to call you in the middle of the night? And we went through financial issues. We went through institutional, in the sense of your building catching on fire or blowing up. We had financial mismanagement, labor. We had ethical questions. And so I just did up a little chart as an exercise of all the things that could go wrong. And when I wrapped up after 10 years with this organization, I had found underneath my blotting pad the little index card I had prepared. And everything that I had identified as a thing that could cause my CEO to call me and say, I need you in here because we've got this happening, had actually come to pass. And so, when I work with nonprofits, I say, in the same way when you get on a plane, they say in the remote possibility of there being a problem, here's how you put on your safety vest, and here's how you do your safety instructions, and so on. I tell my clients, think about the things that could happen, and are you at risk because you don't have things in place to keep something from happening? So if you fundraise a lot, can you keep your credit cards and checks and so on, financial information of your donors secure? If you have a strike, how are you going to continue to meet if it's a service provider to youth? How do you protect youth from possible exploitation, and how are you going to screen? So that anticipatory work comes through consultation at all levels, because a communicator like the CEO doesn't know everything right down to the last detail of an organization. They have the broad strokes. So they have to work with all employees to say, what's happening in your division or your team that could go wrong? And how can we take steps to help prevent that from happening? Or how to manage it if it's something that's, an inconceivable event or an unusual event. So I really agree with the consultation process and planning, because stuff happens.
Yes, it does. Go ahead.
I was going to say that COVID-19 is a great example, because you talk about being prepared and anticipating the ones that we don't see coming. And a lot of people out there have been calling this COVID-19 a black swan. It's no way a black swan. I mean, pandemics were predicted for quite a while ago. In fact, the UK government had done an extensive study on this in 2016, and it was shoved under the carpet. And that's why they found themselves where they were, with the lack of PPE and masks and everything else that happened at the beginning. Interestingly, organization failed even as we were into the pandemic for 3 months with all the lockdowns around the world, failed to anticipate and have the discipline to think, is this going to get worse? How much worse is it going to get? And so one of the things that we did recently is we take part in this exchange with a number of organizations. It's like a conversation, a chat around case studies. And a major organization gave a case study on how they handled it. And it was all about what they did right. And me and another person listening in there were saying, well, if you do a case study, clearly you should be identifying what we missed in order to learn and do better, which is another failure of a lot of organizations when they prepare. So often, once the crisis is over, you're like, oof, thank God it's done. Now I want to get back to business as usual. And they don't take the learnings and they don't share the learnings. And then again, it doesn't build resilience. It's very often memories are short, management or people change, and there's no record, no continuous learning, and COVID is going to be one of them. And it's really quite amazing that it's inability to scenario plan for the worst in COVID.
You know, one of the things that I find interesting about the concept of planning is that we often are considered by management to be the chicken littles of the organization. Everything is crisis. And early in my career, one of the great lessons I learned from a really smart person was essentially the first person you talk about crisis is the boss, him or herself. Find out from them first what keeps them awake. One of the big mistakes we make, we're so eager to plan, so we get things ready. We do all the research and the rest of it. And then when we present something to the boss is sort of taken aback saying, whoa, that could never happen to us. You know, we can't worry about that. And, you know, we have to think about, you know, the role of these people in a future context. And the idea of avoiding talking to the person who's going to likely be in charge de facto going forward in situations. You want to talk to them first because what worries them the most is where we generally get permission to start preparing. When we prepare for something we're not ready for or think about, often they will say no to further work until they are better convinced. So you really have to think about the order in which we talk about and plan to talk about getting planning done. And it has to start, I think, with the person who's going to wind up being in charge, at least initially, go forward. Then you have a base on which to gain some credibility to do all the other things we've been talking about here. And that is where, Caroline points out, you discover what's going on in the divisions. And you have a better sense of what people at the line, so to speak, worry about. But getting that permission to start is very, very difficult. And again, especially for us, because we talk about it so much. I personally hate the term crisis management. It's a hard term. It's old. It's used to scare people to get cooperation, money for budgets. You know, what we learned from 9/11 was that if you want to get senior management involved, even in a catastrophe at that level, you have to change your thinking. And the term that came out of that tragedy was the term readiness. And readiness, when you ask about readiness with an operating person in a company, that's a whole different combination or conversation. When you talk about crisis management, the senior manager looks you in the eye and says, "No, wait a second, Caroline. We can't afford to solve every problem here. Cool your jets on this a bit." Using this approach about readiness is a very powerful word. Readiness is a management word. Crisis management is management. They don't believe it either.
Caroline, you used the word scenario planning. And I do agree that every organization should inventory the prospects for crises. But is part of that determining what the threshold is before it's declared a genuine crisis? And who makes those determinations? I mean, I think of something like a data breach, sort of a newfangled crisis over the last several years, or as we've seen more recently, companies being held hostage as their data is, encrypted by bad guys who look for ransoms to be paid before they'll provide the organization with the encryption keys. at what level do you declare a crisis? And from department to department, who's responsible for saying it's a crisis at this point? Before that, it's an issue.
Well, so first of all, I think there's a difference between what you do on the risk management, so the pre-loss, the preventative phase, the detection phase, in terms of flagging according to probability and severity of impact, the types of things that could happen to you as an organization. And of course, the CEO needs to be asked, but it's a company-wide exercise. Unfortunately, risk management is often too abstract. It's handled by a handful of people that are, moving into enterprise risk management, and the rest of the organization doesn't always understand it because it's too abstract. But anyways, that's where it starts. And for every critical risk on your risk matrix, there needs to be business continuity plans. Business continuity plans are based on scenarios, a number of given scenarios. Crisis plans, first of all, there should be one crisis plan, not multiple plans, because it is the modus operandi when the organization gets into crisis. A good crisis plan really consists of three sections: a policy, a set of guidelines, and a workbook, which is the only part that you use during crises. In the policy, you need to link it to the risk response levels and determine the criteria at which point the crisis needs to be escalated. And I think, again, there is confusion in terminology between alert, you ring the bell, you notify, you inform, you escalate, which is you inform upward, you mobilize, you put on standby, and you activate the crisis team. And these terms are all over the place. And then business continuity comes on board, and business continuity is decided that everything comes under business continuity, which it could be a semantic exercise, but actually there is a difference. So scenario planning is at the level of risk, but is also when you're in crisis, is anticipating by a detailed stakeholder mapping and analysis what else and how else could the situation twist and turn. And this, in my mind, is counterintuitive. Most people hope for the best and then plan for the worst. Leaders need to plan for the worst and hope for the best. And it's a discipline that needs to be more implemented at management level.
John, I worked with one organization, it was a bank, and what they did with their crisis planning was they established sort of a hierarchy, and they said, all right, we've determined that this type of an issue becomes a crisis at this level. Now, at this level, we're calling it a green crisis. We are going to staff the response center during business hours, and the crisis team can go home at night. At this level, we're staffed 24 hours a day. At this level, we do even more. Does that make sense to you, to have defined levels of a crisis or degrees of a crisis?
We've done that for a few institutions, everything from insurance to even hospitality, where what's important about what's really valuable is that there is a yardstick that everyone can refer to and everyone understands. This is how we're going to evaluate the situation. This is who makes the call. This is how communication happens. So it's more elaborate maybe than every organization needs, but it can be very, very valuable. What's really important is the communication end of it. And everyone knows, whether you have a DEFCON system or a yardstick, everyone knows who is it that will decide what stage we're in and who activates the group, who activates the crisis team and the ancillary groups that will support it.
Great. I have one more.
Another hour.
Yeah, I know. I have one more question. We have 3 minutes, and I have to read this promo for the August circle. But let me throw this one last question out here real quick. I'll take whoever wants to answer this in 30 seconds. We haven't talked about employees, and since my job now is exclusively working on internal communication, where do employees fit in crisis readiness and the role of the leader in preparing employees for addressing a crisis?
they're in the lead, because basically they become the knowledge base of what's going on from their perspective. And if we somehow leave employees out of this communication strategy, you're going to wind up with all kinds of other things that people think are going on. And what you say, the reporters and the families, the victims, they're going to go to people they know in the company to find out what's going on. So in my scheme of things, the third most important response group requires attention in the hierarchy of response are employees ahead of everybody else.
People come first, and your own people come first. That's the advice that we give.
And people in your company are communicators. If I run into Caroline in the supermarket and I know she works for Company X, and I've just heard on Twitter or Facebook or whatever that Company X just had this thing, I'm going to say to Caroline, hey, what's happening? You work at Company X. And if Caroline doesn't have an answer, then my confidence is going to be eroded. And Caroline may not feel comfortable because she doesn't know what's happening. So her confidence is eroded. So you always have to think that your employees are forward-facing to consumers, clients, and stakeholders as well. So they should know as much as you can share in your venue as a CEO or management chair, as much as everybody else.
Great. And Jim, you're right. We do need another hour. One question I hope to get to that we just don't have time for is whether crises are really crises. I have a colleague, Chip Griffin, who says he's never seen a crisis that put a company out of business or ended up reducing the value of the organization over the long term. He sees them as short-term blips, and I was hoping to be able to talk about that, but at least something to chew on. I do want to let everyone know what's happening next month on Circle of Fellows, because it's different, and I have to read this. I didn't write this, so I have to read this. The session is called Time Will Tell. We've got an exciting and different sort of program coming next month to the Circle of Fellows. During the recent IABC World Conference, Brad Whitworth and Mark Schumann led a highly rated interactive session that examined how we use time to positively impact worlds we hope to change, lives we want to touch, and differences we want to make. Brad and Mark will reprise much of that session, joined by Alice Brink and Jane Mitchell, as the five of us talk about what we are doing with our time. Here's how Brad and Mike describe the upcoming session. We fill our days fighting the realities of time. Maybe it's time to stop the clock, take time to reflect, and recommit to what we contribute to make ours a better world. The two will also unveil the first draft of a time manifesto that emerged from the session at the conference. Next month's Circle of Fellows participants will be invited to contribute their ideas to this living crowdsourced document during the session, and will receive a copy of the manifesto afterwards. So be sure to join us next month for the Circle of Fellows. It will be time well spent. That is on Thursday, August 19th at noon Eastern, and we'll get the promotional materials out for that right around the 1st of August. Caroline, Jim, John, Martha, thank you so much for joining us today. Thank you, as always, to Anna Willie, who is our executive producer, the behind-the-scenes force that makes these things happen. And we'll see you all next month for this different Circle of Fellows. Thanks, everyone. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone.